So Jason Brown, Minister in the Baptist Campus Ministry at Drexel University, and this is Peace and Power Christian Fellowship, the peace of Jesus Christ to change our lives, the power of the Holy Spirit to change our world. We are starting a brand new series, the summer term Bible study for Drexel's Sunday evening conversations. We're looking at selected passages from 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. The title of this series is Heavy is the Crown, the rise and fall of the Hebrew kingdom. And this is the third video in the first lesson. The first lesson is looking at King David, but looking more at the shift from judges to kings. If you're part of the in-person Bible study, we will be talking about this on June 29th, 2025. If you can stop by, you're welcome, but this is that discussion as well. And in this, the third video of the first lesson, we're going to be looking at what it means to transition from the leadership of the judges to the Davidic monarchy, the leadership of a king. And that is a very interesting transition in the life of Israel, where Samuel, Saul, and David all play a part in that transition. Let's just kind of an introductory thing. Look at the judges cycle. Israel will, the judges repeats this cycle over and over again, and most of the parts are there. Israel sinned against God. God allowed foreigners to oppress them. Israel cried out to God for help. God raised up a judge to deliver Israel. Israel had rest and peace, but then they sinned again. And the cycle is very, very common throughout the book of Judges. Sometimes a part or two is missing. Sometimes the piece is abbreviated, but that is kind of what it means to be a judge, to be called by God to deliver the people from a specific oppression at a specific point in time and place, and not necessarily as an ongoing leader after the threat or the oppression has been dealt with. And very seldom, and it never works out well, do we see the judges create any sort of lineage. Like their children never work as the next judge. Some things happen with Gideon. We tried that with Samuel. It just doesn't work very well as well. So it is God empowers a specific individual to deliver the Israelites from a very specific oppressor that they have called out to help for. Now, the king is different. As we're transitioning from, the judge to the king, Samuel lists a couple things that will be the rights of kings. And this is right after Samuel complains that the Israelites are asking for a king anyways. And we looked at that in the previous part of this lesson, in the previous video. But this is what Samuel says that kings will be able to do, as opposed to what has been happening already in the nation of Israel. Kings will have a standing army and be able to draft your sons into that army. Kings will have palace servants and be able to draft your daughters into those palace servants. Kings will be able to seize property from you and from others, and they will have land that belongs to the king. Kings will be able to tax and use that money for wars or for just the government or however the king wants to use that money. And kings will be able to bring people and sort of force them into government labor positions. Whether or not that's high up overseers or just workers on building palaces or roads or just things around the kingdom. The kings will be able to require you and yours to come and work for the king. These are 5 things that Samuel lists in chapter 8 as the assumption from the judge. So we're moving from the judge to the king. Here's how the king is going to be different. These are the rights of a king that a judge doesn't have. Interestingly to note, when we look at King Saul, it gets a little confusing whether or not King Saul is a judge or a king. King Saul has some things that complete the judge's cycle and doesn't do everything that Samuel warns about a king would do. For instance, 1 Samuel 11, King Saul going after the Ammonites reads a lot like an account from the book of Judges. The Israelites previously sinned in the previous chapters by asking God for a king. And the Ammonites come and start oppressing the Israelites. God allows the Ammonites to oppress specifically the town of Jabesh Gilead. Jabesh Gilead cries out for help. Their cry out for help is to their fellow Israelites, not necessarily to God, which is an interesting difference from the typical judges cycle. That cry for help to Israel is heard by Saul. Saul is filled with the Spirit of God, which is an interesting thing in Saul's life and in some of the judges' narratives. Saul rallies the Israelites to fight. There's no real standing army pictured. Saul just calls out everybody and comes and to join me, and Saul delivers Jabesh Gilead. Now, the major difference between Saul and a normal judge pattern is there is no peace afterwards. It basically, First Samuel seems like Saul is always at war with the Philistines, with someone else, even internal strife with David. There is Saul is a judge. If Saul is a judge, Saul is a judge that never brought peace. And there's no comment of whether or not Israel ever really turns back to God within Saul's lifetime, which is part of the judge's cycle as well. So, although Saul has a small standing army, there is very little mention of the other rights of the king as detailed in Samuel 8. There's no mention of servants, no mention of land seizure, taxation, or forced labor. There doesn't seem to be anything with Saul that he establishes a capital and taxes the people to provide for the army and the capital. There is no idea of people work for Saul as a means of government. Saul is anointed as a king, but functions much more like a judge, but a judge who is constantly at war and a judge who never just gets to the point where the judge can just kind of step back. Saul functions like a judge, but acts more like a king, which is different when we look at David. David had a standing army that would fight offensive wars without him. The whole Bathsheba thing starts with when kings go off to war, David sent Joab and the army to go fight. David had an army to go fight, and David sent that army someplace else. David takes the census in 2 Samuel 23 to see how many men he had to go and fight. The judges always respond to a threat. David went and sought out lands to conquer. Very different from a judge and King David. And Saul leans much more towards the judge side than King David. David has concubines take care of his palace. We see that in 2 Samuel 16:21. In First Chronicles greatly expands on David's servants and workers that he pulls from the nation of Israel to help run the government that the king is doing. Saul kind of has a table that David and Jonathan are at and other people are at, but David seems to have so much more expanded that kind of idea of a palace and a throne. David took the city of Jerusalem, not from the Israelites, from the Jebusites, but he made it his capital and even with a palace. So David owns property as the king. There is a capital, there is a palace. David is a king over Israel in the city of Jerusalem. There is not necessarily a record of David taxing the Israelites. He definitely taxes the conquered nations, but the census of 2 Samuel 24 could have been used easily to tax as well as a military draft. And David appoints many overseers and other officials throughout Israel. This is detailed more in Chronicles than in Kings. So David fills all the rights of the king. Saul doesn't do that so much. Samuel warns that a king will have these rights, and it seems like David moves the ball forward in being a king in Israel that Saul never did. Saul functioned much more like a judge. Now, that's interesting. A lot of people will say, well, it took time for the nation of Israel to get used to the idea of having a king. Even David functioned more like a judge in Hebron than he does in Jerusalem. So, this idea of developing the concept of Israel having a king. Israel asked for a king, but did they even want a king until they got there as well? So, some practical questions and applications of this as we move forward. In what ways can you see leadership model of a judge being spiritually better than a king? Are there ways that having a king could be spiritually better than having a judge? How is leadership good and necessary? How can leadership be misused? Do you see any parallels between leadership of a judge and the church leadership? How about a king? I would say one of the big reasons why it seems like God wanted Israel to have God as their king and just function under judges is judges were given by God. And you had to go out and cry out to God, and God would deliver you through a judge. There are often times when we look at leadership, we turn to the leadership for help because we expect the leadership to help us, and we don't necessarily see the leadership, well, God helping us through the leadership. The leadership takes God out of the equation. The leadership, we expect the leadership to be in communication with God, but we just complain to the leadership instead of taking our needs and our ideas directly to God. So having that middleman of a king over the nation of Israel, and we expect the king to help us, and not so that we don't have to depend on God as much. We depend on the king. Now we can assume that the king depends on God, but we depend on the king instead of depending on God. That is one of the ways that the leadership, like that, the different styles of leadership could have a spiritual effect. Much more conversation to be had there. Hopefully, you can drop down in the comments section and add some thoughts and insights of the difference between the judges and the kings and how that would affect us spiritually. I would love to hear them. As always, there are two ways to join this conversation: in person Sunday nights at 5 p.m. in the JEMIC, or these weekly wrap ups on YouTube and WordPress. I'm all over the social media: Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, WordPress, YouTube. Like, subscribe, and follow as appropriate. I would love to continue this conversation with you on any of these platforms. Hopefully, we get to have this conversation in person real soon, or, via some other form of communication. Until then, have a great, great week. I'll talk to you later.